Chapter 1: The Impossible Scenario. Imagine waking up tomorrow and something is terribly wrong. The Himalayas are gone. Not damaged, not covered in clouds, not partially collapsed. Gone. The world's highest mountain range has simply disappeared. The Himalayas stretch for roughly 2,400 kilometers across Asia and contain some of the highest peaks on Earth. But they are far more than a collection of mountains. They influence winds, rainfall, rivers, ecosystems, agriculture, and even the climate of an enormous part of Asia. So what would happen if they suddenly vanished? Would India become a desert? Would the monsoon disappear? Would the great rivers of Asia dry up? And could such an event actually change the climate of the entire planet? Today, we're going to explore this impossible scenario using geography, atmospheric science, geology, and climate science. But first, we need to understand why the Himalayas matter so much. Chapter 2: The Wall That Changes the Weather. The Himalayas are not just enormous mountains. They form a gigantic natural barrier. To understand their importance, imagine air moving across the Indian Ocean toward the Asian continent. During the summer monsoon, warm and moisture-filled air moves northward. When this air encounters the Himalayan mountains, it is forced upward. As the air rises, it cools. Water vapor condenses, and clouds form. Eventually, enormous amounts of rainfall reach the Indian subcontinent. The Himalayas, therefore, play an important role in the distribution of South Asian rainfall. But there's another side to this story. The mountains also help prevent extremely cold, dry air from the interior of Asia from moving freely southward. So the Himalayas act almost like a gigantic climatic wall. Now imagine removing that wall. Chapter 3: India Without the Himalayas. If the Himalayas suddenly disappeared, one of the first major changes would involve atmospheric circulation, land heating, and the Tibetan region. The monsoon system would not simply switch off overnight. That's important. The Indian monsoon is influenced by many factors, including ocean temperatures, atmospheric circulation, land heating, and topography. But removing the Himalayas would fundamentally alter the system. Rainfall patterns would change. Some regions could receive considerably less precipitation. Others could experience rainfall in completely different locations and seasons. The familiar climate patterns of northern India would no longer be the same. And this leads to one of the biggest questions. What would happen to India's rivers? Chapter 4: The Rivers That Feed a Continent. The Himalayas are one of the most important high-altitude water sources on Earth. Snow and ice stored in the mountains contribute to river systems that support hundreds of millions of people. Among them are the Ganges, Brahmaputra, and Indus systems. These rivers provide water for drinking, agriculture, industry, ecosystems, and countless communities. Now remove the Himalayas. There would be no Himalayan glaciers, no Himalayan snowpack, and the geography of the river systems themselves would be dramatically transformed. Some rivers that currently originate in or cross the Himalayan region would no longer exist in their present form. But that doesn't mean every river in northern India would instantly become completely dry. Rainfall would still exist. Groundwater would still exist. Other mountain systems would still contribute water. The real change would be the destruction of the enormous high-altitude water storage system that currently feeds major Asian rivers. And the consequences would spread far beyond the mountains. Chapter 5: The Food Bowl of Asia. Now, Consider agriculture. The Indo-Gangetic Plain is one of the world's great agricultural regions. Millions of people depend on water from rivers and rainfall to grow crops: wheat, rice, sugarcane, pulses, and many other crops. If the Himalayan system disappeared, both water availability and rainfall patterns would change. Farmers could face enormous uncertainty. Some areas could become significantly drier. Others might experience different patterns of flooding and rainfall. Irrigation systems would have to adapt. Food production could decline in some regions. And because agriculture supports huge populations, the consequences would not remain local. They could affect food prices, migration, economies, and political stability across Asia. But there is an even bigger question. What would happen to the temperature? Chapter 6: A completely different Asian climate. The Himalayas influence climate on a continental scale. Their enormous elevation affects atmospheric circulation and interacts with the Asian monsoon system. Without them, the atmosphere over Asia would behave differently. The Tibetan Plateau would also be fundamentally transformed if the disappearance included the high terrain associated with the Himalayan-Tibetan region. The result would be a radically different climate system. Northern India could experience major changes in temperature and seasonal patterns. Central Asia could also be affected. The monsoon could shift. Storm tracks could change, and the distribution of rainfall across Asia could be reorganized. But here's something surprising. The Himalayas are not responsible for creating the monsoon all by themselves. The Indian Ocean and the heating of the Asian landmass are also crucial. So the disappearance of the mountains would not mean that India suddenly becomes completely dry. Instead, the entire climate system would be rearranged. And there would be another enormous consequence. Chapter 7: A world without Everest. Mount Everest would be gone. But Everest itself is only the most famous symbol of a much larger geological story. The Himalayas were created by one of the most extraordinary collisions in Earth's history. The Indian tectonic plate moved northward and collided with the Eurasian plate. That collision continues today. The mountains are still being shaped by tectonic forces, erosion, earthquakes, rivers, ice, and weather. If the Himalayas vanished suddenly, Earth's surface would be dramatically different. The landscapes, ecosystems, valleys, glaciers, and geological structures associated with the range would disappear. Thousands of species adapted to Himalayan environments would lose their habitats. Snow leopards, red pandas, Himalayan monols, and countless other organisms. The disappearance would therefore be not only a geological catastrophe, it would also be an ecological one. But would the rest of the world notice? Final chapter: The mountains that hold Asia together. So, what would happen if the Himalayas suddenly disappeared? India's climate would change. The monsoon would be altered. Major river systems would be transformed. Agriculture would face enormous challenges. Millions of people could be affected by changes in water availability. Entire ecosystems would disappear, and the geography of Asia would become almost unrecognizable. But perhaps the most fascinating lesson is this: mountains are not just obstacles on a map. They are active components of Earth's climate, water, geological, and ecological systems. The Himalayas may look like enormous rocks covered in snow, but in reality, they influence the lives of hundreds of millions of people. And they remind us of something extraordinary about our planet. Sometimes, a single geographical feature can influence an entire continent. The Himalayas are still rising. The rivers are still flowing. The glaciers are still changing, and the mountains are still shaping the world around them. The next time you look at the Himalayas, don't just see mountains. See a climate system. See a water tower. See an ecosystem. See millions of years of Earth's history. Because without them, Asia would be a completely different world.